I really appreciate everything you said about me, Dr. Crystal Lucky, but what is most important for me and personally touching is that you would actually make an effort to call me by my name. And that means a lot to me, coming from where I come from, where I remember when I was baptized as a convert to Catholicism, I was told you cannot use that name because it is not Christian. We will call you Emmanuel. Thank you, Dr. Lucky. And thanks to Barbara. Thank you. Thank you. And thanks to Barbara for putting this together and for all the work you've put into this, you and your team, to bring the world together around this very crucial theme, but very special person, Pope Francis. I'd like to begin by acknowledging two caveats. First, despite its somewhat suggestive title, my presentation is not a disquisition on papal anatomy. So I would request, oh, actually this morning someone told me, you're the one giving the talk about the tiger behind the Pope. No, it's not. So I'd request the audience to kindly banish from your imagination any vision of a papal rear end riven with arrows. As a metaphorical device, the African proverb, which serves as title, offers a salutary warning on the danger of leading change in an ancient, complex, and venerable institution made up of people of different cultures, languages, and mindsets. And that could be the Church or the Vatican. As a second caveat, I present a view from the global South without claiming that it is the only valid one. My perception of the first 5 years of Francis's papacy is unashamedly positive. Proof and justification for this bias should become evident further on. My primary purpose is twofold: to scrutinize the leadership style and agenda of Pope Francis, and to examine some reactions and disputes that such leadership provokes. And I'd say, rest assured, I come to query Francis, not to glaze him with flattery or adulation. At the completion of the 5th year of his pontificate, Francis has earned a global brand stature and distinction as an important staple of scholarship and debate. Columnists and scholars, commentators and pundits, Vaticanologists and aficionados revel in the fecund pastime of trying to decode, to deconstruct, and to decipher the 265th successor of Peter. Analysis of the foundation, intent, and direction of Francis's papacy has generated an impressive and ever-growing collection of academic, popular, and devotional literature. The impact of his prophetic voice and compelling witness, variously rendered as the Francis effect, the Francis factor, influences and shapes multiple global discourses, from conversations about poverty, migration, and climate change, as we so powerfully heard this morning, to concerns about atrocities in Syria, in South Sudan, in Congo. Ironically, even though students of Francis engage this enterprise with studied erudition, as we do here this weekend, there is no mystery about Francis's leadership style and agenda. In many respects, I believe, Francis is anything but a revolutionary. Practically speaking, as a voice crying out in the world, the radicalness of his leadership is as unexceptional as the dogged perspicacity of a hunter is habitual. Yet, because he leads the way he leads, Francis risks ending up with an arrow or more in his behind. In my opinion, the most striking imagery of Francis's leadership evokes not the rather injurious intent of a hunter, but the fulsome compassion of a pastoralist. We've heard this before. This quote, this phrase, inspired by animal husbandry, where Francis has used to advocate a leadership model of shepherds with the smell of the sheep. As I see it, this ideal embodies a commonplace pastoral practice that is not realized simply by the pungency of one's body odor or the acuity of a person's olfactory senses. Leadership in such pastoral manner summons practitioners to venture outside the cozy comfort of the sheepfold into the peripheral and precarious habitat of a wounded, marginalized, and impoverished humanity. Such leadership style doubles as a call to action, which transforms the Christian community into a bruised, hurting, and dirty community on account of its relentless pursuit of mercy, justice, love, and care for the earth. On the streets, rather than ensconced in palatial episcopal ghettos. Francis's preferential option for the periphery yields, in my opinion, an alternate ecclesiology that is centrifugal by orientation and missionary in nature, precisely because it draws the Christian community towards existential margins. By comparison, this outward-looking ecclesiology seems the polar opposite of a centripetal and self-referential ecclesiology preoccupied with self-preservation and self-aggrandizement. As Francis said to the congregation of bishops, leadership credentials in a missionary church is not fulfilled by, quote, a manager, a chief executive officer of a company, nor one who remains at the level of our pettiness and little pretensions, end of quote. In reality, to take on the smell of the sheep, a leader must be prepared to live like one. Or as a Rwandan proverb says, if you want cows, you must sleep like a cow. Understandably, for anyone in the church, especially self-appointed elites and power brokers, so inured to a life of leisure and ceremony, this kind of leadership presents a tough act to follow. Yet, Francis has not invented a new teaching. As we heard this morning from Father John O'Malley, if Vatican II is to be believed, the joys and hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the people of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, these are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. The novelty, however, resides in the fact that in summoning the church to live solidarity and compassion in spirit and in truth, Francis personally embodies these values in his actions and in his deeds. Hence, Francis is not, as one African proverb puts it, a leader who is afraid to step on cow dung, preferring instead to lead from a safe and sterile distance. And so, what I see a character complementary to and in part illustrative of Francis's exercise of leadership is his personal integrity, which allows him to function as a leader while consistently remaining himself irrespective of situations, context, or circumstances. Whether in Lampedusa or on a papal cortege, crouched at the feet of Muslim women refugees or shunning the ostentation of papal dwelling, these images of commonplace pastoral service signal the authenticity and strength of Francis's character as a prophetic leader, one who is not given to projecting expedientially a public image while concealing a private persona that would betray a disconnect between personal life and professed convictions. His feet dirty smell of the sheep leadership style, to quote Chris Lowney, challenges cardinals, bishops, priests, and the entire church with a tough leadership act. As the title of this presentation suggests, some of us would repel this intrusion on our accustomed self-indulgence and fashion darts and arrows in self-defense. I also believe that Francis's practice of this pastoral leadership has a more pertinent implication for the way it exposes the abiding temptation of those entrusted with authority to prey on the vulnerability of their communities. The putative shepherd could turn on the sheep. In Francis's own words, and I quote, "Bishops and priests who fall into the temptation of money and the vanity of careerism turn from shepherds into wolves who eat the flesh of their sheep." End of quote. Borrowing the words of Augustine, a figure not unknown in these parts, Francis argues, quote, "When the bishop or priest takes advantage of the sheep for his own sake, things change. The priest, the bishop isn't for the people, but a priest or bishop who takes from the people." End of quote. Hence, continues Francis, the lesson here is clear. Quote, "For a bishop isn't a bishop for his own sake, but for the people's sake. A priest isn't a priest for his own sake, but for the people's sake." End of quote. The preceding point suggests the vital importance of self-awareness in the measure of one's limitation and vulnerability in the exercise of leadership. A leader is prone to failure. Francis has demonstrated this self-awareness with humility and simplicity. His suppliant gesture on the night of his election was later followed by a candid self-disclosure to Father Antonio Spadaro, here present, in 2013. "I am a sinner," said Francis. This is the most accurate definition It is not a figure of speech or literary genre. I am a sinner. If that was 2013, consider Pope Francis's April the 8th, 2018 letter to the Chilean bishops, admitting his own serious mistakes in handling the clergy sex abuse scandal in Chile, and with pain and shame asking for forgiveness from all those he has personally offended. And so in the leadership practice of Francis, awareness, particularly of limitations and shortcomings, and the ability to learn from one's failure or to make amends for a mistake represents an essential principle for everyone called to leadership in church and society. In the same interview with Spadaro, Francis admits, quote, "Over time, I have learned many things. The Lord has allowed this growth in knowledge of government through my faults and sins." End of quote. We too insist Francis are human and sinners, and we are tempted. So self-awareness as an aspect of the personal and leadership charisma of Francis is memorialized in his motto, miserando atque elegendo, by having mercy and by choosing him, borrowed from the homilies of Bede the Venerable on Jesus' merciful and forgiving gaze on Matthew. As Francis himself explains, and I quote, "That finger of Jesus pointing at Matthew, that's me. I feel like Matthew," end of quote. Many studies attribute the origin and centrality of mercy in Francis's pontificate to the transformation that has characterized his personal journey. Mercy, therefore, it is believed by some, is not only the central message of Christianity, but also a constitutive element of Francis's leadership vision and agenda for the church. In the formulation of Cardinal Walter Casper, what, quote, "the church needs most today is the ability to heal wounds and to warm the hearts of the faithful. It needs nearness, it needs proximity," end of quote. Francis himself would render this more categorically in Evangelii Gaudium when he writes, quote, "The church must be a place of mercy, freely given, where everyone can feel welcomed, loved, forgiven, and encouraged to live the good life of the gospel," end of quote. The well-documented narrative of Francis's character transformation offers a compelling case study in personal conversion achieved through grace and grit, humility and docility. Now, supposing the leadership portrait of Francis that I'm painting here is accurate, the question arises, what is so tough about following Francis's leadership act? What accounts for the suspicion that persists among pockets of resistors who have joined cause with formidable champions of discontent to stoke a backlash against Francis's leadership? Now, I admit there are no monocausal answers to these questions. On a cursory level, judging from the portrait that I have just sketched, if Francis is a reformer or a prophet, his pedigree resides in his personal witness and his advocacy for openness to the possibility and necessity of change and renewal, rather than an autocratic and mindless pursuit of doctrinal change. the Irish Times columnist Patsy McGarry is only half right in arguing that the change instigated by Francis is more a matter of leadership style than substantial change of doctrine. Yet, when critics attack the Pope, it is for perceived threat to the security and self-sufficiency of venerable tradition and orthodoxy. Examples of Francis's approaches which strain tradition and orthodoxy are not hard to find. They include, for example, his call for discernment of circumstances, allowing communion for divorced and remarried Catholics, his invitation to priests to assume greater pastoral responsibility for sins, like abortion, previously deemed unforgivable, his suspension of judgment on the humanity of gay men and women, preferring instead to tread the path of mercy, compassion, and dignity, the often forgotten papal reprieve for theologians considered delinquent and hitherto doggedly pursued by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, his singular ability to lend renewed urgency to the plight of the poor and marginalized, migrants, refugees, victims of human trafficking, homeless people, the recalibration of the center of ecclesiastical power in favor of the global South, the commission to study the question of women deacons in the early church to inform our conversation today about contemporary role of women in the church, the devolution of liturgical translations to the local church, and his checkered attempts at greater transparency, whether in financial accountability or the credibility of measures to address sex abuse scandal, and so on. Contrary to McGarry's position, for the coterie of discontents, these issues are more than just stylistics. They bother on consequential questions. The contemporary assault on Francis have intensified in respect of all these points. Nor, I would add, is reform in style an inconsequential undertaking in the charged atmosphere of ecclesiastical politics. So, whether we qualify it as a matter of style or of substance or even of managerial reform, quite clearly, Francis's leadership has roused a phobia for change and a nostalgia for a monolithic body of doctrine, as was recently epitomized by the Dubia saga. Besides, to anathematize the phrase, "It's always been done that way," as Francis so brazenly did, further provokes the rage of custodians of tradition who are unreceptive to change and wary of those who claim to bring it. Thus, as the Dubia authors demonstrate, Francis's manner of leading change and the direction of change itself trigger with visceral intensity, albeit obliquely, the question, is Francis still Catholic? Under these circumstances, the barbs, the arrows, and missiles aimed, so to speak, at Francis's rear end are particularly pointed. Openly excoriated for allegedly flirting with heresy, lambasted as agent provocateur of schism, and lampooned for seemingly harboring a denatured streak of Protestantism and pseudo-Anglicanism to the detriment of solid and clearly defined church teachings. Francis, if we believe his bitterest critics, represents a catalyst for the disintegration and destruction of the bark of St. Peter. Even while admitting to a shred of admiration for the Pope's global PR prowess and charismatic appeal, doubters will dismiss as unconscionable the possibility of a heretical Pope being God's instrument for ecclesial reform, a la Cyrus of Persia of old. The stridency of opposition, such as evident in Correctio Filialis, the Haeresibus Propagatis, generates what I would call a paroxysm of animosity, enough to prompt the Guardian columnist Andrew Brown to declare that, quote, among some of his own followers, Pope Francis is one of the most hated men in the world today, end of quote. Now, although in my opinion, Brown overstates, even sensationalizes the situation, his statement does contain certain elements of reality. However, given such extreme perception of the man and his message, I am increasingly persuaded that Francis's greatest service to the church in the 21st century as its spiritual leader remains his singular, if somewhat contested, illuminating testimony, which exposes with painful clarity the moral schizophrenia of a church where tangled political hypocrisy resents prophetic leadership while applauding doctrinal bigotry. Over the last 5 years, the open polemics between Francis and some episcopal leaders has resulted in a somewhat negative portrayal of the Pope as a weak protagonist of change who is incapable, seemingly, to make a concerted push for a radical transformation. However we assess the effectiveness of Francis's leadership and reform agenda, it bears noting that the struggle for influence and supremacy in the highest echelons of ecclesiastical power is neither new nor exceptional. Francis himself makes an incisive analysis of this tension by distinguishing two types of power struggle. According to Francis, type 1 is an atavistic struggle for power in the church that he says has existed since the time of Jesus himself. It is sustained in the church by powerful networks vested in careerism, favored by social climbers, and bolstered by good-natured simony. Type 2, says Francis, and I quote, is a struggle for true power, which Jesus taught by his example of the power of service. True power, he says, is service. Using principles derived from the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola, Francis has this to say about the implication of the second type. To be a leader in the church is to be, quote, promoted to the cross and promoted to humiliation. That's true promotion. Promotion that makes us more like Jesus. That's love. That's the power of service in the church, and that's the way to serve others better who are on the way of Jesus, end of quote. Without ascribing any of these qualities personally to himself, I believe that Francis's leadership eminently embodies this principle of selfless and self-sacrificing service of the gospel. So, Where does all this leave Pope Francis at the start of the 6th year of his patron ministry? Judging by a recently published survey of US Catholics conducted by Pew Research Center, Francis enjoys an approval rating that would make him the envy of many of the world's political leaders. But I prefer to treat such favorability rating with caution, because too often it amplifies the partisan view of things, typified by so-called conservatives, traditionalists, or right-wing, and their liberal, progressive, or left-wing adversaries. This binary taxonomy is not necessarily productive. It has the effect of simplifying a very complex situation. Besides, actually, it represents a projection of a Western, mainly North American, hermeneutical framework that prioritizes the clash of ideas and generates heated single-issue debates as a dominant lens for reading everything from Francis the Pope to Homer Simpson. Although ideological tensions run deep in the short lifespan of this papacy, it will be wrong to reduce the claims to a simple either-or culture war schema between a triumphalist left and a disaffected right. Weightier issues are at stake in the church and in the world, as we heard this morning. And Francis knows it. My thesis then is that behind the political tension and contention around Francis's leadership of the church lies the fundamental question of the inclusion of Catholics of various manners of life. And I mean women, men, gay, poor, displaced, refugees, migrants, people long relegated to the margins of orthodoxy by zealous defenders of ecclesiastical privileges. Speaking as an African, papal energy has never been so palpable, not in the manipulation or fabrication of doctrines, but in the embodiment of the practice of mercy, of love, of justice, and care for God's creation, not forgetting the joy of the gospel and sense of humor, especially in those places where humanity's brokenness confronts the healing message of the gospel with prophetic urgency. Francis's pastoral prioritization of these situations offers a more authentic benchmark for assessing his leadership credentials than do ideological antipathies. Nonetheless, to be fair and balanced in my view of Francis's leadership, I have to admit that perhaps some of the arrows and missiles are not entirely without justification, although some are misdirected and ill-timed. The words struggling, snail's pace, stalled appear quite often in the appraisal of Francis's actions and motives and agenda. John Chittister, the respected theologian based here in the US, for example, has argued persuasively that, quote, some things that must change clearly have not changed in these last 5 years. Instead, there is smoke without fire. Commissions promised, but not created. Questions acceptable to ask, yes, but answers still scarce, end of quote. Granted, there is ample material to formulate a litany of unresolved issues under this pontiff. But I would argue that the charge of promise of action and the absence of results, hollow leadership, unclear leadership, unfairly mischaracterizes Francis. Mischaracterizes him as a genial but unreliable double agent who pays lip service to change while surreptitiously propping up the status quo. Besides, those who advance such criticism hastily obituarizes Francis's reform agenda as if it were already a finished business. Clearly, it isn't. However, the fact is to be understood, I believe 2 points are worth noting here. First, true, some steps are nearly not enough. And while it is no doubt true that Francis has made some mistakes, and he would say serious mistakes, much has changed in 5 years. As Martin Luther King once said, quoting another minister, "We ain't what we ought to be. We ain't what we want to be. We ain't what we're gonna be, but thank God we ain't what we was." By his own leadership philosophy, Francis distinguishes the practiced political penchant of charlatans for occupying space, presuming to preserve authentic tradition, from the genuine desire to inspire and generate durable processes of change. In my own opinion and judgment, Francis's fundamental agenda aims to create processes of renewal and reform. Like the parable of the sower, the seeds of change that he sows face multiple threats. A second note, Francis's struggles suggest the imperative of a corrective dose of realism to his initial and perhaps naive underestimation of the formidable power, systemic intransigence, and instinctive rigidity of structures and protocols of the Roman Curia. Leading change in the hierarchical maze of the Vatican is an exercise beset with difficulties and frustration. Francis has vividly articulated this reality when, quoting a 19th century Belgian diplomat, Archbishop Frédéric François Xavier de Merode, he likened reforming the Curia to cleaning the Sphinx of Giza with a toothbrush. Nor, frankly, should it surprise anyone that rebuking members of his top leadership team as corrupt and cancerous bureaucrats, given to political intrigues, cliques and complots, seduced by ambition and vainglory, plagued by spiritual Alzheimer's, leprosy, and emptiness, only escalates the frequency and intensity of arrows aimed at his rear end. In the final analysis, if I may overstep my remit and proceed to offer a counsel to Pope Francis on the 5th anniversary of his service of leadership, it is this African proverb: if you want to go fast, walk alone. If you want to go far, walk with others. The Irish theologian and scripture scholar Sean Frayne is quoted as saying that it is a mistake to think that a pope has the power to do anything. Now, as a self-confessed reformed autocrat, I believe that Francis gets that message. My style of government, says Francis, as a Jesuit at the beginning, had many faults. It was my authoritarian way of making decisions that created problems. Now, this immensely contrite papal confession aside, not forgetting the botched Chilean abuse scandal, we possess no guarantee that Francis has overcome completely his proclivity for what papal biographer Austin Avery describes as high-handed exercise of sovereign authority that manifests as, quote, a highly personalistic government which bypasses systems, depends on close relationships, works through people rather than documents, and keeps a tight control, end of quote. Be that as it may, such candid admission by Francis of a propensity to err by a leader of a global organization which has a legendary reputation of obsession with infallibility, such a candid admission by Francis deflates the moral victories and neutralizes the saber-rattling of conservative-leaning Catholics who rail against Francis for egging the church too far away from their entrenched position, and liberal-leaning Catholics who are exasperated that he's not moving fast enough to enact their agenda. Under these circumstances, the true test of leadership lies in the capacity to maintain a healthy process of consultation and dialogue, encourage ongoing learning, remain unwavering in the pursuit of transparency and accountability, and to persevere in humble listening. I believe that Francis passes this test. And so, the Irish theologian and scripture scholar Sean Frayne is only partially right. The Pope can do almost anything, but never alone. Speaking of listening, I am reminded of the Manja people of Central African Republic and the Bambara people of Mali in West Africa, who maintain a rabbit as the totem of a leader. This totemic imagery prioritizes the arduous undertaking of listening over the authoritarian pronouncements of dictats. For the purposes of our conversation today, it also bears resemblance to three key principles that Francis has proposed to the church, namely synodality, subsidiarity, and collegiality. As Francis himself has urged, and I quote, "We need to practice the art of listening, which is more than hearing, but entails an openness of heart that aims to include even those with whom we disagree sharply," end of quote. Therefore, in conclusion, while Francis's leadership has delighted many and discomfited some, a renewed focus on inclusive dialogue and real conversation offers an opportunity to beat the arrows of discord into common ground for conversation and mutual listening in which everyone has something to say and something to learn. As church, I believe we need neither a hunter nor a maverick for a pope, or worse, a curator of a museum of memories. What would suit us best is a leader with a big, humble and contrite heart, open to God and open to the world. And that leader, I submit, is Francis. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your provocative comments. I was sitting thinking about a lot of things about leadership, about the church. I'm not Catholic, I'm Protestant, and have been thinking a lot about leadership in the church, and found your words both comforting and thought-provoking. So thank you very much. We have about, I'm looking at the clock, maybe about 6 minutes for a little bit of dialogue. I know that's not a lot of time, but I think we can get some questions. So I'm going to, I think this microphone works for discussion. And so I'm going to take it around to anyone who has a question. And
Thank you, Father, and so let's stay a little bit more with the people launching the arrows and assault. To ask the question, what is at stake for them? So for me, it's really important when someone is triggered in some way that makes them launch an attack, especially to some idea or person that I hold as emblematic or witnessing to Christic love and discipleship, as I feel Pope Francis is doing. I feel that my responsibility as a theologian, as an ethicist, is to ask the question, what is at stake for that person who feels they have to, their only response, the faithful response, right? Because they think they're doing it out of faith, is to launch an attack. So can you talk a little bit more about what you think might be at stake, whether in the U.S. context or globally, because it's happening from other fronts in other parts of the global church?
Thanks a lot, Trace. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you very much for the question. Yes, thank you. Let me use the word, it's love. It's love. We all love this community we call church. It means a lot to all of us. And so when we react sometimes the way we react, it is because we really deeply, truly love this community. It means a lot to us. But the reality is, the way we relate to and what we ask of this community differs depending on our situations and our circumstances. So while I'm critical of certain positions that I find perhaps unnecessarily polemic, I also want to recognize that wherever it's coming from, there is a deep conviction, a deep sense of belonging and ownership that this reality, this community, is important for all of us. And that is why, in ending my presentation, I firmly believe that we have to engage in inclusive dialogue. It cannot be a question of a triumphalist right and a disaffected left. No. We have to stay true to the message of the gospel to remain a part of this plant. And so for me, the love that each one brings to this conversation is important and ought not to be dismissed. But to make that work for us, we have to be able to engage in honest conversation, open conversation and dialogue. I read something recently about a conversation between Massimo and Ross Dauda. And someone said, here's an example of how to have a meaningful conversation without eating one another. And that reminded me of a proverb that I hold dear, that people who eat together do not eat one another. Thanks, Tracy.
Thank you so much, Reverend Orobator, for the opening lecture, for you not only offer the living testimony of Pope Francis's leadership, but you tried to offer the spirituality and the theological grounding for his leadership. I would like to ask two questions. What would you say to, and how would you respond to the tendency that one could also find that tries to idolize Pope Francis over and against the church, sometimes Christ himself, in the way some people tend to present Pope Francis and his leadership, almost like antagonistic to the church? That's one. And secondly, just this is an aside, but it's somewhat related. Do you see how the act of leadership of Pope Benedict XVI paved way for the top leadership act of Pope Francis?
Okay, thank you very much. About the problem of idolization, I think that's a challenge we face from generation to generation. I was at a retreat center in Lusaka, Zambia, about maybe 4 weeks ago, and coming down the stairwell, I noticed there was this huge life-size photo of John Paul II, huge. And on the corner, there was one of Benedict, a small one, and an even smaller one of Francis. And I inquired about it because I was curious, what's going on here? And someone told me this place is run by Polish nuns. Okay, so my point is, idolizing leaders, it's a kind of propaganda that is not unknown and it's not exceptional in terms of the church. But again, I think what I'm fascinated by is the way whoever is the object of attention handles that. Leaders that I'm familiar with will build monuments to themselves while they are still alive. We spend millions, you probably know this, you're from Nigeria. We spend millions of dollars building a monument to who? Jacob Zuma. And he came personally to inaugurate that statue. So that's my point. How does the person, the subject, the object of attention, deal with such? And if you look at the life of Francis, it's very clear. As the English would say, that's not his cup of tea. That's not his style. He will be the first. He will be the first to condemn that. Your point about Benedict paving the way for Francis, well, it's obvious he resigned. He resigned. That paved the way. And I'm not saying that just as a flippant comment. I'm saying that very seriously. I remember Jerry Adams, the leader of the IRA, who resigned recently, who said very publicly, a clear sign of a leader is knowing when his time is up. So I don't know what you were expecting me to say, but I take this very seriously. I talked about the measure of one's limitations and vulnerability as an important principle of leadership. I think someone like Benedict exercised that. And here we are with Pope Francis. Thank you very much, Anthony.